I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you episode number 87. In this podcast dedicated to the ongoing improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. This week we're going to throw in one of those oddball episodes that's not exactly drug-related. It's definitely brain-related. This is something that came through originally as a listener recommendation. I actually did this interview close to a month ago, but we had a little bit of an episode backlog, so we're just getting to it now. But this is an interview with a doctor in New York, a psychologist named Robert Reiner, who specializes in something called virtual reality therapy for the treatment of phobias and addictions and debilitating stressors of that nature. We're talking about both how the use of technology has sort of revolutionized his practice, what he's been doing, and he also has some really interesting tips that involve breathing techniques for the reduction of stress that are completely non-technology requiring, and I thought were really interesting and just kind of a good thing to have in the bag of tricks that anybody can carry around with them since we are all breathing all the time. So that'll be in the main interview. If you hang around until the end of the episode, in a scandalous and eyebrow-raising, ruthless listener retention gimmick, I'm going to tell you about a study that seems to show that supplementation of a pretty well-known over-the-counter buy-it-anywhere supplement resulted in a tripling of the frequency of sexual intercourse in healthy adults. A double-blind, placebo-controlled study, so pretty interesting. But don't skip to the end of the episode yet. Just hang around. Let's kick things off with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
Okay, so this Week in Neuroscience is actually a last August in neuroscience, but it seemed particularly apropos to this episode because, well, for one thing, the sort of star of this study, the senior author of the paper that I'm about to talk about, is once again Susumu Tonegawa, director of the Riken MIT Center for Neural Circuit Genetics, who is also the lead author of the study that we talked about last week, doing groundbreaking work in memory based on studies into whether amnesia is a problem with memory storage or memory retrieval. Anyway, this is a study that his team published about a year ago about the relationship between memory's factual components and their emotional feeling. The emotions associated with memories, I guess in science speak, are called the valence, like valence electrons. Why they made that choice, I don't know. But the tying of emotions to memories seems also so relevant to phobias, which is what we're going to be talking about in the main interview. Anyway, this seemed like a good one for this week, so here we go. Memories are made up of many elements which are stored in different parts of the brain, so the contextual, just the facts ma'am type information, the kind of stuff that a newspaper reporter would take down, that information is stored in cells of the hippocampus, while the emotional component of the memory, the valence, is stored in cells in the amygdala. So once again, this study used something called optogenetics, which is the stimulation of different neuron cells with light. So in this mouse study, Tonegawa and his team identified particular memory engrams. Engrams kind of the diffuse collection of cells that make up the memory circuit. They gave some of the mice positive memories. In this case, it was some flirtatious courting behavior with female mice and stained those engrams. And then other ones, they gave a negative association with some shock stimuli, mild electrical shocks. So they could then call to mind pleasant or unpleasant memories for these mice. Then they put all the mice in a large area, kind of let them spread out, play around, and they would find for each mouse sort of the default place that it liked to hang out before any memory-based conditioning was applied. And then they would start to apply the positive memory if the mouse hung out in an area that it didn't seem to prefer as much, and vice versa. If it was hanging out in an area that it did prefer, they would stimulate a negative memory, and lo and behold, that did affect the behavior as to where the mouse chose to spend its time. So then here's where the researchers got really tricky. A couple of days later, they attempted to reverse the emotional responses to these pre-identified memories. So in some cases, they would let the male mice hang out with some female mice, get some romantic time, but meanwhile be triggering this same memory, which used to have a negative connotation. Or for the mice that had been positively conditioned, they would trigger the previously positively connoted memory while they were shocking the mouse with a light electrical shock. They did this for a while, then they again would put the mice back into this large area that had been segregated into two zones, and they found that yes, indeed, they had been able to switch the emotional valence of this identified memory. A mouse that had previously sort of been manipulated out of hanging out in a particular area by the application of the memory, now instead was more likely to spend time in that area when that memory was triggered because the emotional valence of the memory had shifted from negative to positive. Now here's what's interesting. In the experiment that I just described, they had labeled cells in a part of the hippocampus called the dentate gyrus. gyrus. So again, this is the fact-based, contextual part of the memory, and that's the part of the brain that they were optogenetically stimulating in the experiment as I've described it. Doing that, they were able to shift the emotional valence of these memories. Now, when they tried the same darn experiment, but instead were optogenetically signaling the memory cells stored in the basolateral amygdala, which is a region involved in processing emotions, they could not induce a switch in the emotionality of the memory. The mice still continued to behave in the same way as when those memory cells had first been labeled. This suggests that the emotional associations are encoded somewhere in the neural circuitry connecting the dentate gyrus to the amygdala. Says Tanagawa, the plasticity of the connection between the hippocampus and the amygdala plays a crucial role in the switching of the valence of the memory. So really interesting findings and, of course, far-reaching implications if we can gain any sort of handhold into manipulating the emotional content around factual memories. That is really, really sci-fi stuff. So it has been another banner week in listener interaction, on email, on a couple of phone calls, on some Skype sessions, on everything else. Really appreciate everybody that's been reaching out recently, getting a ton of great ideas from people as far as new episodes to do, people to reach out to, stuff like that. Building up a little bit of a backlog in my email inbox again, so I apologize if anybody's been waiting for more than a couple of days on responses, but one super awesome thing. Last week I scanned the international iTunes reviews and caught up on some stuff in there. Back to the US store, we've had a bunch of new reviews in the last couple of weeks, to the extent that I'm not even going to read through all of them right now. I'm just going to grab a handful and catch up later. But don't think for a minute that I'm not reading all of these. It's just, we've got 6 of these things since the last time I looked in the US store, so that seems a bit much. But Jackie O. Pascal said, for those of us interested in better living through chemistry, this podcast is king. 96 Jews said, I've listened to every episode you posted and the content you provide is amazing. Over the past year, I've done my own research and worked with medical professionals to optimize my mental health as well as my physical health because of the information you were able to provide, and it's changed my life for the better. And Franklin Co. said, wow, I'm speechless. Fast talk, and I'm listening at 1.5 times. Awesome. So thanks to everybody mentioned there. Thanks to you who have put in reviews and I haven't mentioned yet. And thanks to those of you who might be considering putting in reviews but haven't done so yet, but may do so in the not terribly distant future. We even have a handy little how-to video on the website about how to leave an iTunes review at smartdrugsmarts.com/rate-us-on-iTunes with a hyphen between the words rate us on iTunes. I will also throw in a reminder about our email list, which we send something out to about once weekly with the catch-up of what we're publishing, both on this podcast and on the website, and also sort of a roundup of the neuroscience information that we find interesting from around the web. Sign-up's easy to find if you go to our website, or if you're on a mobile phone in the U.S., you can text SDS to the phone number 33733. As those of you who are dutiful listeners to every episode know, a couple of weeks ago we launched Axon Labs with a website up at axonlabs.io where we are selling 2 different nootropic stacks, Nexus and Mitogen. Nexus being a cognitive stack based around aniracetam, and Mitogen a general energy stack based on loading up the intracellular mitochondria with everything that they need to do their job, and also has some nootropic properties of its own based on ingredients like sulbuthiamine. Anyway, our first orders have now been actually getting delivered to people, so people have it in their hands now and in their mouths and in their tummies. I want to thank everybody who's been part of that early set of orders and just remind the rest of you that it's out there. No obligation, of course, but if you want to do something to support Smart Drug Smarts, checking out either or both of those stacks is, of course, very, very much appreciated. And we will have the obligatory link on the Smart Drug Smarts website, or you can just go to axonlabs.io.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So our guest today is Dr. Robert H. Reiner. He is the executive director and founder of Behavioral Associates and has been practicing psychology since 1981. He's on the faculty for the Department of Psychology at New York University Medical Center and is probably best known for his work in treating anxiety and phobias through biofeedback and virtual reality therapy. We're going to be talking today about virtual reality therapy, which was something that I hadn't heard about before. So again, this will not be a drug-centric interview, but it is a really interesting one, and definitely listen for the breathing advice that he gives midway through this talk. I think the upsides of having this in everybody's little behavioral bag of tricks for anything that might make you nervous is really huge, because you're always breathing. You've always got this tool at your disposal. So let's jump in with Dr. Robert H. Reiner.
Virtual reality therapy is basically an exposure model. Say somebody has fear of flying and they are terrified to get on a plane. They have panic attacks, they hyperventilate. Sometimes the plane has to land, they make such a big scene. So with virtual reality therapy, we kind of trick their brain. They put these 3D glasses on, and for all intents and purposes, it's very similar feeling to being on a plane, not just in the way it looks, but in the way it feels and the way it smells, the way it vibrates. The audio is identical to jet engine noise, and people kind of get the feel of it. Patients certainly know they're not really on a plane, but that's a good thing, not a bad thing. In the same way that you can watch a cartoon and know that it's not real, yet you can get emotionally involved with it. This is kind of like that, only we look at it more as stress inoculation training. In other words, when you get a flu shot or an inoculation, you get a small dose of the disease, your body fights it off, and then when it actually hits, you've had prior experience in dealing with it, so you mount a better defense. We're doing the same thing with virtual reality. We're giving somebody a taste of the experience, only we're pairing it with relaxation instead of anxiety.
How many different primary types of common phobias do you have support for?
Pretty much any kind. I'll tell you why. YouTube has made things a lot easier for us. See, back in the old days, we've been doing this since 1999, and if somebody had a phobia of the Queens Midtown Tunnel, which is very common around here in New York City, I would have to go to the Queens Midtown Tunnel with a high-definition video camera, go through the tunnel and record the sights and sounds, and then run it back through the program. Now with YouTube, everything is available. The only thing you don't get is a tracker. Now what a tracker does, think of a wireless mouse in reverse. If you turn your head to the left in virtual reality and you're on a plane, you're looking out the window. If you keep your head straight, you're looking at the seat in front of you. Turn your head to the right and you see the person next to you. That's what the tracker does. That's why the older virtual reality programs are so expensive. Now, with cell phones, they have gyroscopes in them. That's why you can use video cameras. For that reason, you can really do any kind of virtual reality exposure that you want. So, the most common phobias we see are fear of flying and public speaking anxiety. People who cannot stand up in front of 3 people and give a toast. I've met people who's a guy who's a very successful attorney, never went to court, but he meets with clients all the time. He could not stand up and read the New York Times to me in my office. He was too scared.
Something like fear of flight, it would be hard in this day and age to completely avoid getting on airplanes, but it seems like you could probably still wimp your way out of public speaking if you really had a mind to, but people are coming in to solve these problems.
Well, what a lot of people do is they do, using all sorts of clever tactics, avoid stuff like that. But sooner or later, say a guy's daughter's getting married, and he's got to give a toast. Or a student, a graduate student, has to defend his dissertation. So you've got to stand up in front of the faculty and speak publicly. There is something unique about the idea of speaking publicly that frightens people, that doesn't frighten the same people if they have to ask a question in front of 100 people.
Is there a good psychological explanation for why that might be the case?
Well, the idea of being frightened in front of people, I think it stems way back to prehistoric times when you had to quickly recognize somebody's face as friend or foe or stranger. So I think that the idea of looking at strange faces activates some old stuff in our DNA, and certain people are just, unfortunately, wired incorrectly. We see it as a wiring problem, not as some unconscious conflict, which was old-style psychology.
Some common phobias, like you say, make sense that they would be part of our evolutionary history, things like fear of spiders, fear of snakes. But then, of course, we don't really have any reason to historically be afraid of airplanes because we've only had them for 100 years.
Actually, that's a very good point, which is why I think people are afraid. There's no precedent for it, really. I mean, if all the years humans have walked the earth, it's less than a century that our brains have had to contend with getting into a long metal skinny tube that flies 5 miles up in the air almost at the speed of sound. It's pretty amazing. And statistically, it's one of the safest things a human can do in a given day. Yet that information never helped a person with fear of flying. The reason for that is it bypasses neocortical function. In other words, the part of our brain that's firing is the very primitive part of our brain. It's the limbic system. the emotional area. It's called the amygdala.
I was going to ask about that because there's sort of the three levels of the brain, the neocortical human-only brain, then the cortex that's shared by other mammals, and then the reptilian brain deep on the inside. For fight or flight responses, that's actually coming from the reptilian level, isn't it?
Absolutely. Which is why, by the way, believe it or not, you can induce a phobia in a mammal. If you flash a light, for example, and give them a shock, sooner or later they're phobic about the light. That's classical conditioning. Now, if you do that, you can desensitize them exactly the way that I do. Because the second half of virtual reality treatment for a phobia involves something called biofeedback.
Tell us about that.
Biofeedback is a way of learning to control systems in the body that are typically difficult to control. An example is heart rate. If I strap a monitor on you and we see on a computer monitor a beating heart with a number next to it, and I say, try to make it go down, you look at me like I have 10 heads. How do I do that? Besides holding your breath or something. And you do that because a feedback loop gets set up between your brain, your heart, and the computer. And without conscious awareness, just because you know you're trying to make it go down, it begins to go down. Now, initially, it'll be a completely random event. You won't know how you did it, but you'll replicate that sensation. And this is called operant conditioning. You're getting positive reinforcement, and sooner or later, and it takes the average person 5 hours to learn how to do it, you can make your heartbeat go up or down whenever you want to.
And this is essentially the same process as like a young baby uses to learn how to move its hands and wiggle its toes and stuff like that. It's just like firing different motor cortex nerves and seeing what happens.
That's exactly right. Initially, they're random events. And that's, by the way, what releases dopamine. This is called a prediction error, where something happens that's unexpected. The brain all of a sudden comes to attention. The message is, we're ready to learn. Dopamine gets squirted and new things are learned. Once you learn the technique, there's no more dopamine. It's a different part of the brain taking over now. With the biofeedback from before, there's a technique we borrow from the yoga community involving abdominal breathing. People always ask me, what's the most basic and powerful thing you can do that's not expensive? And I tell them abdominal breathing. Put your hand on your navel, and that's the area that should move, not your chest. With biofeedback, we put a strain gauge there, and we can see when people are breathing from their chest or from their stomach, but should be abdominally breathing. And after a few minutes of 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, something very interesting happens. Your heart rate begins to sync up with your respiration. In other words, when you breathe in, your heart rate climbs very quickly. When you breathe out, it drops very quickly. That's called coherence or phase. Now, each person has a different, we call it a sweet spot, because bigger the drop in heart rate, or what we call a swing. If your resting pulse is 70, and at 5.5 breaths a minute, let's say your pulse goes up to 82, and then when you exhale, it drops to 60. That's a 22-point swing. But let's say at 6.25 breaths a minute, you get a 38-point swing, and that's the biggest one you have. That means that that's the breathing rate you need to do to shut off the body's fight-or-flight response. In other words, when you're breathing this way and your heart becomes coherent with your respiration, it temporarily disables the fight-or-flight response. In plain English, it means you can't get nervous about anything. Now, you may think nervous thoughts, but you will not viscerally generate the response from the limbic system. So once we get people in that state, they feel like it's a drug high, like they've been injected with Valium or something. We pair that with the virtual reality.
So you're measuring people's breathing at different rates of how long they inhale, how long they exhale, and looking for the maximum difference between how fast their heart beats on the inhale versus the exhale. And whatever that rate of breathing is sort of the optimal rate of breathing for them to keep calm for that particular person?
A+ explanation. Yep. That's exactly right.
How much does that vary from one person to the next?
Well, 95% of the population, it's between 5 and 7 breaths a minute. The most common area is right around 6. It's 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. There are actually many apps you can download. They're called paced breathing that will do this for you. There are all sorts of ways to generate relaxation responses. This is the most efficient one because patients can actually do it on the plane. The mean length of treatment is between 12 and 16 sessions. That's all it takes. Typically, a big problem is people sometimes say to me, Dr. Reiner, I don't get it. I was told as long as I get myself on a plane, I should be able to get used to it. How come I'm getting worse? I say, how do you act on the plane? I'm petrified. I say, well, that's why you're getting worse. You're behaving protectively. The message to your brain is, if I'm acting this way at a musculoskeletal level, this must be dangerous. And the brain remembers. So next time, you get worse. That's why there are 3 conditions that by definition get worse over time: phobias, addictions, and obsessive-compulsive disorder.
I think probably all of them have a learning component built into it. It's like even if you're doing the wrong thing, you're building neural pathways around those wrong behaviors, and essentially you're getting better at doing the wrong thing.
You're absolutely right. Think of it as you have a sled on a hill, right, of fresh snow, and you go down the hill. You make 2 tracks. You walk back up the hill, and you go in those 2 tracks again. Do it over and over again. Pretty soon, you're going down very efficiently. Now, it doesn't look too inviting to start all over again because you go slow, but that's why habits are hard to break. The brain is much more neuroplastic than we think it is.
Let's go back to the technology of how you're doing a virtual reality therapy. What were you doing as far as treating patients before you got into virtual reality therapy, and how have you seen the differences since this has become part of your practice?
I've been a psychologist since 1981. I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation on this topic using regular videotape feedback. I was teaching Southern women how to be less shy and more assertive in the way they interacted with people.
Bucking cultural trends all the way.
Yep. Oh, they hated me down there. They said, there's some guy from New York teaching all the girls to say no. So anyway, what I would do is set up a little vignette. Say you're walking up to a movie theater and there's a long line, and someone comes up to you, and then there's a woman's face, and she says, excuse me, these are all my friends in front of you. Do you mind if I cut in? It's just one person. And then the camera's on you. You've got to respond. Now, later on, we would hire people to rate how assertive these people were. That was called poor man's virtual reality. There was a technique, actually, by a South African psychiatrist named Joseph Volpe, who developed a theory called systematic desensitization. And he had patients use imagery because there was no virtual reality there. So if somebody were afraid of a plane, he would say, okay, I want you to imagine that you're getting onto the plane, and now you have that unusual smell of a plane, and people are jostling around. He would generate all sorts of vivid imagery to try to get the patient involved. And then he would, instead of biofeedback, which he wasn't using, he'd have them rate themselves on what he called the SUD scale, subjective units of discomfort. But I remember as a graduate student in 1978, thinking to myself, you know what? From what I know about human nature, there's no way a person is going to generate vivid imagery of something they spend their whole life avoiding. And I really couldn't do that with a straight face. I never offered that to a patient. And I remember thinking to myself, when something like virtual reality ever became available, it would revolutionize my profession, and it took 20 years. Unfortunately, Dr. Volpe didn't live to see his theories proven correct. He was a guy who was born the wrong generation. Our success rate is 92%.
That's incredible. How long after the treatment has subsided do you sort of check to see if people have relapsed or not?
Believe me, they call us if they relapse. Sometimes people come in for booster sessions. Flying is not something you do on a regular basis. And if you avoid it, then sometimes the old fears can creep back in. Remember, we've created new tracks, but the old ones are still there. So, I would say probably 10% of people, I'll hear from them again. The good news is that once they learn the breathing technique, it's something they practice the rest of their lives because it'll work in any situation.
Being afraid of something that is right there in front of you, like you're on an airplane or there's a rattlesnake rattling at you, that makes sense to me. What about something like drug or alcohol addiction or overeating or one of these things that doesn't necessarily have a physical component to put a camera on?
That's a good point. But we're talking about addiction here, not a phobia. And the old theory was based on what was called negative reinforcement, meaning an addict simply was trying to hold off the discomfort of withdrawal. When the theory fell, when How do you explain this? Methamphetamine is much more addictive than alcohol, yet the withdrawal from alcohol is much worse than the withdrawal from methamphetamine. You can stop doing meth, and you're probably going to sleep a little more. You might feel, a little woozy, but you're not going to get sick. If you're addicted to alcohol and you go through DTs, 20% of people die. Even heroin withdrawal does not kill people. Alcohol is a real serious drug. So if you think about this kind of treatment, there's one important component you got to consider. There's a difference between wanting and liking.
We did an episode on dopamine not too long ago, and that was exactly something that was discussed during that episode, that dopamine is related to wanting, not just liking something, but actually being willing to exert effort to get it.
That's right. It's amazing stuff, because if you are low on dopamine, you can enjoy something just as much, but you're not going to work very hard to get it. The issue about phobias, though, is fascinating, because you get otherwise very high-functioning, rational people that almost seem psychotic. That's how wild they can get. There's a woman, an attorney, that I treated about 10 years ago, where she was passed over for a partner because she couldn't fly. She was a good courtroom lawyer. Twice she'd won an appellate court. But she was so upset when they didn't make her partner, she made what turned out to be one of the worst decisions of her life. She decided to fly to California by herself to confront this client. And about 90 minutes into the flight, because she was claustrophobic also, which is about 25% of people with fear of flying are also claustrophobic, her anxiety really began to accelerate. And to give you an idea of how otherwise rational people can really lose it, there were these two obese women near the front of the plane, and she walked up to them and screamed at them, "You girls are really fat. I want one of you to get up off your fat butt and get to the other side of the aisle so you balance the plane, otherwise we're going to tip over." And when they said no, she ran to the door thinking she could open it and jump out. Like I said, because people come in, and so many people have seen psychoanalysts for years and years and years. So the guy I just met last week, who 8.5 years of 3 times a week psychoanalysis, the analyst told him that once he got over his unconscious narcissism and need to be in control, he'd be able to fly. That's all that was offered to the public before virtual reality came to be.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much for Dr. Robert Reiner taking the time to do that interview. I've been lucky to be relatively non-phobic in my life. The one thing that I do have sort of a weird phobia of is slugs, believe it or not. I grew up in the state of Oregon, where we are blessed with a variety and abundance of slugs. I guess Northern California has more banana slugs than we do, and those are the really, really gross ones. But at one point when I was a very, very young Jesse, I stepped on a slug when I was barefoot out in the backyard and had this squash slug kind of slimed onto my foot, and I couldn't get it off and freaked out a bit. And ever since then, me and slugs have had kind of a bad working relationship. But now that I know about virtual reality therapy, I'm kind of thinking maybe I'll go to YouTube and find some slug videos and see if I can inoculate myself. And next time I go back and visit home, maybe I can make peace with my slug neighbors. But now we'll take a hard right turn from slugs to supplement-induced increased libido in the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Okay, so we were going through and looking at the ingredients that we have in Nexus and Mitogen. There's a total of 10 ingredients between those two supplement stacks that we just put out. And just looking at some studies and seeing, hey, are there any interesting stones we haven't turned over yet as far as the effects of these things? And we found a doozy. Actually, one of the ingredients in Mitogen, which is not a terribly unique ingredient, if there's anything that you're already supplementing with, chances are vitamin C, ascorbic acid, is probably one of those things. It's a vitamin which humans are famously unable to synthesize. We need to get solely through our diets. There are other animals that synthesize it internally, but humans somewhere along the way lost that ability. But because it's something that's available in a lot of foods, apparently there was no evolutionary pressure for us to keep up the ability to internally synthesize. In any case, here's the interesting thing. A 2002 study showed that high-dose vitamin C supplementation, this was 3,000 milligrams per day, which is a pretty high dose, led to a 3.5 times increase in the frequency of sexual couplings over a 14-day trial. This was double-blind, placebo-controlled, and a total of 81 healthy adults between the ages of 18 and 44. It also improved their mood, as found by a decrease in the Beck Depression Test scores for members of the group. They had 42 of these adults that were given real vitamin C and 39 that were on placebo, so not a giant study numerically, but on the other hand, the frequency of sexual intercourse going up from an average of 4 times per month to an average of 14 times per month was a numerically large enough result to definitely make the finding significant, salacious, and worth its place as a ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Okay, that is the entire episode, number 87, now hitting the history books. If you liked what you heard, please recommend this podcast to your friends in the real world and or drop social media bombs all over your favorite social media pipeline and let people know that Smart Drug Smarts tickles your brain in a way that you appreciate. The show notes for this episode will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything I talked about here. I'll be back at you next Friday, as usual, as we bear down towards that all-important 100th episode of Smart Drug Smarts that's now starting to look not as far away as it once did. It's going to be the pre-Halloween episode, it turns out. I actually did look at a calendar. We're gearing up for that. We're actually gearing up for some stuff in the near future that'll be really exciting. I will probably have something kind of conspicuous to announce in a couple of weeks here. Just getting all the ducks in a row. Keep your eyes peeled on the website. I'll probably be publishing an article later on this week if you're into that whole reading thing. I'm going to be doing a bit more of the writing thing in the coming weeks, but I digress. Most importantly, back at you next Friday. Have a great week in the meantime, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.